I'm surprised to find myself in this position after all these years. It's good to look back and see things. So thanks for the chance to look back. I grew up on a small farm in north central Iowa, and it was kind of a old McDonald's farm type thing where Dad had hogs and cattle and we raised chickens, and was fairly self-sufficient as far as, you know, most foods. And I was one of the late babies that comes along and got a chance to see a style of agriculture that was really from a much older generation. Dad was going to retire by the time I was a high school senior, and my brother, older brother, wasn't going to be farming, wasn't going to go into the farming. And so Dad didn't upgrade his practices or equipment, farm equipment. So I got a chance to see a little bit of how an extended crop rotation went, how small fields worked, livestock and integration, all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't something that I was studying particularly at that time. It's just how you grew up. Dad was real big on paying attention. You know, you have to pay attention. You have to notice things. And so we grew up with the expectation that we would be paying attention and thinking. And I had the privilege of him expecting that his daughters were every bit as smart as his son, and the expectation that we could do anything. So that was a real gift that my folks gave, but Mom was very much into making sure that I got a good education and that I understood and paid attention to things as well. My brother, being older, went into fish and wildlife biology, which, you know, didn't really mean anything to me much other than having come from the farm. I, you know, understood something about the land. He took an interest in me when he went off to college. All of a sudden, I wasn't his pesky little sister. And he gave me Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. And I read that in high school and was very much moved and transformed in terms of my land ethic, because it was something that I shared with my brother. And he also managed to get me in on a prairie burn of a prairie in the Prairie Preserve system in Iowa. And I was hooked by it. As a high school sophomore, I raked a fire break across this prairie. And from that forward, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something out in the environment. And so that kind of set me on that course. And I got a degree in botany. Mom was sure I would not like teaching, which I wouldn't have in a classroom, but I loved teaching outdoors. And that's what led me into environmental education and a series of degrees and things after that. I studied it very intensely, really enjoyed the experience of working with kids outdoors, and just had a great time. Did that for 12 or so years in actually, by the time I add all of the years up, probably closer to 14 that I did environmental education, and really enjoyed all of that, and found it a challenge to teach in the same day, maybe fourth graders to senior citizens, and you know, everything in between. So it was a great deal of fun. Took a lot of energy. So then I stepped back and said, oh my gosh, it's adults who own the land who are making the decisions about the land. So everything from soil and water, which I was always interested in, and had coursework at Iowa State University. But that was kind of the, you know, transition from working with children to working with adults. And so I master's degree in adult education, you know, that was a natural progression in my world. And I also got a chance to become a soil and water conservation district commissioner. in 1997, kind of at the same time I was transitioning from working with children to working with adults, and finishing up the degree in adult education. And that was an opportunity that had much richer outcomes than what I would have even imagined. Through that, I had a chance to work or be appointed to the governor's, or a governor's appointment to the State Soil Conservation Committee is what it was called at the time. And I served 2 consecutive terms, which gave me 12 years as a window at that statewide level, which I think anytime you expand your own work from, a very local particular place to perhaps a board position in a group or association, it changes your perspective so that you see the broader implications of actions or lack of actions. And so from that position on the State Soil Conservation Committee, I had the chance to see and understand a lot more. And it's coincided with the time that I was a commissioner, attended a conference, heard that women own or co-own half the land in Iowa. And as a lifelong conservationist, I was just dumbfounded. It was like, what? What? Are you crazy? Because I sat through 2 consecutive CRP re-enrollments. And if we had 50 folders, which by law have the landowner's name on them, thumbed through those folders, there were 3 women's names out of 50. Went through that twice, 2 complete cycles. And I could look at the plat map in the county, and that was when it was still easy to see, there were plenty of women's names on there. I could see where the half ownership came from, but they weren't there. And I knew women cared. That's the other thing. I knew women cared a lot. It wasn't just Aldo Leopold's land ethic. We share a deep land as community sense. So that's really what launched me into this work from where I started. It was just kind of by accident, and I managed to make my way. I started e-resources group in about 1997, about the same time that all of that was happening, because as a woman with a degree in rural Iowa, there weren't a lot of career options. And of course, my husband and I moved to rural Iowa in 1982, 83, right at the height of, for us, the farm crisis. So there were very few jobs, hardly any jobs for him. I stuck with my job for 12 and a half years and looked around and could see there was no upward movement for women in the system that I was in. Looked around in the community, there really wasn't a whole lot of opportunity for me. So even though it hadn't been a goal to start a business, there were 3 of us that were kind of in a similar situation, women in conservation who had no upward mobility possibilities, and we started a business. So it kind of started that way. Right away, one dropped out. She had other opportunities, and so it wasn't. 2 of us went forward with our business and started it 70 or not 97, 98, somewhere in that was when we incorporated. So it's been kind of a funny journey, and I'm just kind of amazed to look back and say, I made it. I made it this far. That breathless feeling that you have when you don't know where your next paycheck, actually, 6 months out, you don't always know what's going to come in, and somehow something always does. So that's how I got to be here.
Thank you. Jean, can you share to anyone who's viewing who might not know what a prairie burn is and why prairie burns?
I know it. Pyrobotanists, we kind of get going on that. Iowa's, well, tallgrass prairie and lots of ecosystems evolved with fire. And what I didn't know at that time was the indigenous history of managing with fire. So all of us are Johnny-come-latelys when it comes to learning how to work with these landscapes, and we have a lot to learn. And so burning the prairie was a way of rejuvenating the prairie plants, burning back the woody tree invaders and taking it back to a healthier state. But there's still a lot we don't understand about that whole process, but it was a very exciting thing for me to get in on. I felt very grown up being treated so well by my brother, and also having the privilege of learning that management and the ecosystem of prairie and all. I was very definitely hooked on prairie at an early age.
Such a beautiful landscape. Thank you. I'm curious, when you talk about the double tenure that you had with the commission, was it the Soil and Water Conservation Commission?
That was at the state level, it took a second governor's appointment. So I had to be nominated, appointed. Iowa Senate had to approve the service. So there are 9 members, 6 of whom represent farmer portions of the state, and I was representing the middle third of farmers in Iowa. By virtue of the fact that even though I own farmland, and I get an income from that farm, that by their definition made me a farmer, even though I wasn't actively making management decisions, certainly not at that time. I am now, but I wasn't then. So
at that time, what was the breakdown of men and women representing that farmland on the commission?
Which is interesting because by law, Iowa law, that commission had to be gender balanced and politically balanced. So I think the last year I served was 2015. So I was appointed in 2003, 2004, something like that. And I came onto the commission and it was that work had already been done. I will say that it was the most interesting board service because of the balance. The discussions were, I think, a little heftier. Not all of the women stepped up and had much to say, but those of us that were used to working with men and knew to get some airspace and, state something as our responsibility. I think we had some robust discussions. I don't know that the decisions were anything but what they could have been. We tended to work more by consensus, so we had very few split votes. But it was a good experience because I got to see more of the conservation issues across Iowa, and I also got to see from a policy standpoint. Not that we made policy per se; we were kind of an oversight board. We got to see how policies impact conservation on the ground, or don't, as the case may be.
Fascinating. So when you started eResources, and I know you mentioned that sort of that scary point when one branches off, takes a leap and thinks, oh gosh, where is my next paycheck coming from? 6 months down the line, are we going to be okay? I have a question that's twofold. If you could talk a little bit more about what held you during that uncertainty, but also what's your favorite work that you do as a business owner in consulting?
I had the security of, we worked really, really hard to pay off our mortgage, which gave us breathing room, which was super, super important because, we moved here at a time when interest rates were high, prices were high. We didn't have a lot of experience when we were buying and probably should have negotiated and didn't, you know, all of those kinds of things. So we paid a lot for our first mortgage. And as soon as we got that paid off, which I think was like 96, that gave us some breathing room. And being able to breathe when you're starting that kind of a venture, I could see my way through a year. At that first one, I knew I had enough income from one contract that would get me through a year of our expenses, my share of the expenses. My husband always worked. And that kind of helped give me some breathing space. It was never, I would say there was never less than what I could say was 3 months of income ahead. I could see, and I quickly learned to write grants and take on odd projects. I have a host of funny, odd, quirky projects in my background. And as a small business owner, probably the fun part is being able to say yes to interesting things. The burden is that when anybody calls and says, hey, what do you think? The answer is always yes. Because if the word gets out that you're busy, then all of a sudden people quit calling because they say, oh, she's too busy. So when anybody calls, the answer is always yes. Yeah, I'll work you in. Be happy to do that. That's the, you know, it's kind of the good and bad, but being able to take on interesting projects is just such a joy. And I get to work with people that I enjoy. And that's the other tremendous treat. I can say no if somebody calls that I'm just not real crazy about working with. Not that it happens very often. Most of the time, people that call me are people I'm delighted to work with and have wonderful experiences with.
As a consultant in environment and energy and education, what sorts of things are folks calling you for consulting help with?
It is such a fun mishmash. I have enough historic interpretation background that I get involved in projects that are kind of quirky and complex. So a historical museum had a collection that was an organic chemistry lab that was part of the building that they were in, and they needed some help how to interpret, which of course, organic chemistry in college wasn't necessarily my best subject. But on the other hand, I understand storytelling for the public because of that interpretation background. So everything from an organic chemistry lab associated with a poultry veterinary supply company to streetcar trolley little thing in Des Moines that they're setting up a little park to represent, you know, and honor and tell the story of the streetcars and the trolley operators and all in Des Moines. So high contrast. And in with that, some farm interpretation plans of all things. There's a learning farm not far from here. They wanted to know how to tell their story. What was, you know, what are some things that you could do? So those are the fun interpretive projects. And I've done some very in-depth research projects. Probably one of the recent big ones was with the National Organization for Professional Women in NRCS. Had looked at the fact that there were not very many women in the upper echelons within at the highest pay grades in NRCS, and they wanted to embark on a study as to why, you know, what are the barriers, what are the things that are holding women back. So they contracted with me and a colleague, Rebecca Christoffel, to conduct a survey and research into, you know, where are the barriers coming from, how might they even address them. And so we did the basic research, and they've gone on and taken it from there and are addressing those things. So from fun projects to very serious research projects, things to do with evaluation, always looking at how are we accomplishing things in projects with Women Food and Ag Network. Are we moving the needle? And how are we looking at how women do their work? That's the thing that's fascinating the most right now, is what do we understand about the work for conservation that women do? And I'm finding that we have a particular lens that we look at it that's largely based on how we have looked at men doing conservation, and we're looking at women in the same lens. And I'm saying, whoa, there's a whole lot of work that women do that never gets tallied in these forums. And what is it that women do? How do we go about getting conservation done? How do we move the needle? And do people ever see us doing that? And for the most part, they don't.
That's fascinating. When you talk about shifting that lens, and the idea that there's these nuanced mechanisms that aren't even being tallied, are you finding ways to, to sort of articulate that which has been so underneath the surface?
I work at it all the time. I'm always working at how can I describe the way women do the work? What can I bring to the table that will help people understand that this is extremely useful and very important work that makes things happen? So right now, one of the things that we've been focused on is looking at the relationships. Super, super important. Women work based on relationships, and that's a real key to how we get things done, because we're always having to work with somebody else through relationships to get change done on our land. Not that men don't also do that. They just approach working with relationships a little differently. The other thing that I understand is that we want credit for working really hard on some of these processes, and even if we don't get the acres changed, geez, it's not that we haven't been working on it. Some of this stuff is really hard. So being able to credit some of that is part of it. But then looking at all the conversations that we have to get that change to happen. It's like, holy cow, just to get cover crops flown on, how many phone calls do I have to make? How many people do I have to line up? How many relationships do I need to draw on if somebody says, oh, I can't right now? Is there any way I can nudge that? Is there any way I can say, oh, but if are you really sure you can't work this in? I mean, you have to have a relationship built up, and some stock and trade, and some trust, and all of those kinds of things, some reciprocity. All that takes so much time. And women are always managing the social relationships. We're always managing those connections. And we never get credit for it because, we wrote a grant and you have to deliver on the number of acres or the number of practices. It's always about the number of something. And I've been on that side of the fence. I understand you got to have something to show for it. But if all we're doing is counting things, can we also count those conversations? Can we count the context, the level of work that goes into these things so that we don't oversimplify what it takes to get these things to happen? So there's a lot of little nuances that I'm playing around with. And that's partly why I'm trying to branch off and trying some things on my own as just e-resources group with women landowners to see if I can test some things without having to write a grant that puts us in a box all the time, because we can't change that box until we can show why it's important to change the box. So I don't know any other way of going about it, just putting one foot in front of the other and keep trying.
This is why whenever we speak about evaluation as a staff at WFAN, someone inevitably always says, we should reach out to Jean. Jean's definitely doing work in this right now.
Yeah.
I'm curious, from a very small micro farmer's perspective, did you say cover crops flown over? So is that really large acreage broadcast cover crops? Is that they're flown over?
It's common in Iowa where you have acres, enough contiguous acres that an airplane can fly on cover crops. So the same plane that does crop dusting, they change out the tanks and can put in seed, cover crop seed, and fly back and forth across the fields and distribute seed. So this time of year, I'm telling all my friends, if you hear spray planes in the air, cheer, because they're not spraying anything. It's well past the time, and they're seeding cover crops. So we want to hear more planes in the air where there are places to do it. There are plenty of places like in Wisconsin where there's, too many trees, smallish tracts. The landscape is, too hilly. There isn't a safe place to spread those cover crop seeds. But there's large areas in Iowa they could just turn on and go.
That's wild. I love that. I'm standing out in a half acre with a 5-gallon bucket, just like splaying oats and peas.
Yes. And I did a little bit of that this year because I'm always trying to experiment on our little farm too. It's not a very big farm, but we end up trying to push the needle, because after Dad retired, he took out all of the interior fences, so the small fields that were useful when he had livestock, because he retired and he sold the livestock and all that kind of stuff. It went into just corn or soybeans. So there were 2 fields, and it was either corn or soybeans. And 45 years of that with conservation tillage really ruined our soil. Not that we understood that at the time. We didn't know what was happening. It seemed like everybody else was doing the same thing, so it must be okay. And it was, at least conservation tillage, there was this residue left and all that kind of stuff. But oh my God, it screwed up our soil so bad. I've been working hard to see if we can accelerate the improvement of that soil. So cover crops are certainly an important step on that process for me. So trying to manage that farm part with a tenant. I mean, he's the one that's doing all the hard decisions about, seed and taking all that risk. But I'm doing that and managing my e-resources group business at the same time. And I think sometimes might be, maybe I should just do one or the other.
I love that. You have your feet in the field, both fields, all the fields.
Yeah.
Switching gears just a little bit to, I think, the education side of your work. I just wanted to share a clip for viewers, and maybe for you as well, if it's been a while since you read this. This is from a 2019 news article from the Freeman Journal. And I'll just share. The Iowa Association of Naturalists and the Iowa Conservation Education Coalition are proud to award Dr. Jean Eells with an IAN-ICEC Award for Excellence in Environmental Education. The award is the Alda Leopold Environmental Education Award for Lifetime Achievement in Environmental Education Excellence and Leadership. This is awarded annually to recognize incredible contributions to the advancement of environmental literacy in Iowa. In 1988, Jean won the President's National Environmental Youth Award. She won Conservation Educator of the Year from the Iowa Wildlife Federation in 1991 and the Outstanding Environmental Educator Award from the Iowa Sierra Club the same year. I kind of get chills just reading that. And I'm curious, when you hear these accolades, I'm wondering what experiences that you've had beyond your childhood do you think have been instrumental in shaping your path as a leader?
I am always taken by surprise. The President's Environmental Youth Award was something that I did apply for on behalf of an outstanding 8th grade class that had just done some amazing work. So I knew that one was coming, and the others have just been kind of, oh, really? How nice of you to nominate me. I've been rather surprised by the others. And I don't know exactly how I have managed to be in this leadership role. I've had a lot of curiosity, and my parents shaped me to believe that I could do things, but I certainly didn't have huge aspirations. For me, it was never about getting a doctorate. You know, I just thought, well, I want to solve this problem. I want to figure this out. And to do that, I know I'm going to have to read books and talk to interesting people and think big thoughts and pay somebody, a coach in university, to make sure that I stay through that, you know, stick with that process. So it's been kind of, you know, backing up into some of these things. I don't know that I was necessarily, I never really thought of myself as a leader. So it's kind of one of those funny situations that I find myself in. It's like, wow, I get to this end of the work and I look back in 1988 and like, whoa, that was a long time ago. And so I'm working on trying to remind myself a little bit more of some of those recognitions. This is a diploma, but these others are recognitions of work that I just keep trying to remind myself that the work is making a difference, that there is change happening. Because otherwise it's real easy to get kind of lost in the particular day to day, and you think, oh, there's so many things I haven't gotten done on my list. You know, the to-do list is just forever and ever, and I forget to look back and celebrate having gotten someplace. So I don't know if that really doesn't answer the question. I have no idea how I've gotten into these, what's shaped me other than pure luck.
Well, maybe, so another question that I had, which I think just digs a little deeper here. So from a perch as a mentor, for example, if you were mentoring a young land steward who really wants to restore our ecosystems, what advice would you give that individual in terms of maybe where should that young land steward be reaching out to for connections and networking and support, you know, on a regional or state level, if this person was in Iowa, for example? Or what advice would you give that young land steward in terms of how to carry oneself, how to proceed through challenges?
I really think going back and listening to the land, it sounds so trite, but listening and watching and paying attention, it is amazing what you can see and learn and what strength you get from restoration. Doing action that at least you believe is restorative to the land, and always keep learning, be humble about that whole process. We don't begin to understand all, again, that those indigenous folks that had the land for thousands of years, when you think about being able to manage a landscape on landscape scales, not just a few acres bounded by a square. That's really impressive. We need to be humble about the knowledge that we don't have. And so that's why I say be really humble about it and listen and learn from as many people as you can. I think it's really valuable to go between the science, the current science, and people that are working more humbly in their knowledge, that have gained knowledge, and work back and forth between them and start to see that a lot of the things that you may have perhaps even poo-pooed about a way of speaking about that land or the plants or some of that stuff, and notice how science oftentimes will come back around and verify and validate that particular position. I think about how we speak about how tree roots are connected and how much more we understand about tree roots and that interconnection and communication, if you will, between them as far as the nutrients that we know. We can measure a lot of those things. So I think a lot of what we understand about restoring and working in a stewardship way needs to plug into as much ground-based knowledge as you can and not dismiss it out of hand. If it doesn't match up right away, you know, you're kind of in this weird space, but just wait. And a lot of times science will come around. A lot of times we don't understand what this is because we can't measure it. And we are so geared toward, and reasonably so, to measure things. Just because we can't measure this yet doesn't mean that it's not a valid way of looking at the land and how to restore it, what it needs, and being mindful of what's going forward as far as climate change and the challenges of being a good steward. I think it takes a little bit of forecasting as well. I think it's really hard. I just think it's hard and probably one of the most fulfilling things you could ever take on.
Absolutely. Before we jump off, I'm curious, with your work with WFAN, is there any particular experience or perhaps, I don't know, dialogue that you observed between women farm owners that sticks out to you as something that gave you hope, or you thought, gosh, this work is doing the thing that we needed to do?
I can think of so many stories over the years of women who have been in meetings and who have said things publicly that were just really transformative. But I'll draw on the work that we've done just this last year with women who went off script. We had a grant to do X number of meetings, expanded a little bit because we had to do virtual because of the pandemic. That taught us how to work with Zoom. And off script we went and decided that, well, since it's not really costing us anything except the time, let's keep meeting. And it's through that lens, that privilege of being able to sit in and listen to those conversations, that I could hear how women are doing the work, how those changes are happening. And darned if every one of them hasn't done something that's significant in their world that moves the needle for conservation. And some of them are looking back now and saying, oh my gosh, how wonderful that we did this. It's just like, wow. And that opportunity to celebrate the achievement, I think, is something that we maybe often don't do often enough. But seeing each one make a change. So whether it's getting cover crops on, and periodically they'll call and say, oh my gosh, my renter, who I've talked to about this for years, just said he's going to do this. And it's just like, whoa, that's change. And how can we make more of that happen? How can we help women make more of that happen? Because we know they can. They can be very persistent, influential, put the lever in where it's needed. We can do it. So I'm really hopeful about where we can go at moving the needle. Are we going to change everything? Probably not. But considering what a low percentage of farmers are engaging in really good practices, I know the narrative is that they're all near gods and, you know, whatever. No, the soil and water tell a whole different story. But if we've got what we have with the percentage of farmers that are doing what they can do now, what if we have women helping them make that transformation, help support them through the transformation, at least the ones that want to? That's got to count for something. Is it all of them? No, it's not an all or nothing for me. It's watching for that incremental change, and pretty soon you see it. So I'm just really hopeful about where we can go, because the more we figure out how women do this work, the more we can figure out ways to support it effectively and change that whole dynamic. So we'll get there.
Spoken like a true seasoned veteran researcher and field worker. We can do it.
We can do it.
Absolutely.
When I think about 2022 will be 20 years from when I first found out that women own or co-own half the land in Iowa. So, you know, looking back over 20 years, this is like, I guess it has taken a while. It feels like it went really fast, but it's taken quite a while. Good. Thanks for asking.
Absolutely. We are so lucky, Jean, that you are doing the work that you do in this world. And at WFAN, so grateful that we get to work with you.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Jean Eells, everyone. And we will provide contact information and some background info along with this interview. So thanks so much, Jean. And it's a pleasure to hear your story.
Great. Thank you.